Thank you very much. So we have time for 25 minutes of questions. Optimists and pessimists are welcome. Start over there and then we'll move around. Yeah.
Hey, I have a question about the Indo-Pacific. Henry Kissinger has said that U.S. policy toward China has largely been a bipartisan affair. It's been largely consistent since inception in 1972. So the question is, how should the next U.S. administration be approaching China policy? It's basically been, since then, a blend of engagement and hedging, which in my mind is sort of strategically incoherent because one arm sort of undercuts the other arm. But I'm sure you've read the Blackwell report. Do you embrace sort of taking a tougher line against China, trying to exclude it in some ways from the order? Should the U.S. take a stronger hand in the next administration?
Well, I've read the report because my organization published it. He's referring to a report by Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis, which basically argues that the attempts to integrate China have not succeeded, and that they believe we should, to use a phrase that's used in a different vein, that we should pivot towards a more assertive policy towards China, one that is more concerned about the growth of Chinese capabilities and more concerned about what China will do with them. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I think we may get there, but we're not there yet, in my view. So actually, what you call strategically incoherent, I would call strategically sophisticated, which is the policy of engagement and hedging, which I believe is the only policy that makes sense for China at this point, which is where you can, you try to integrate China into either existing arrangements or arrangements you can live with. And that's a conversation we need to have with China. What are the regional or global arrangements both of us could support? And then if China acts in ways that we believe are hostile or antithetical to our interests, then we would take the appropriate action. We also, even before that were to happen, we keep our alliances strong and so forth. So we try to put into place mechanisms. So again, China is incentivized to act in ways that we would call quote unquote responsible, and is disinclined to act in ways that we would consider, that we in any way would judge to be unhelpful. I come out where I began. I don't think there's anything inevitable about the future of U.S.-Chinese relations. I think diplomacy and statecraft on both sides will matter. I actually think the biggest single variable may not be U.S. foreign policy, but it may be what goes on inside of China. That for all the debate about U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis China, there's a lot of threads of consistency. And this relationship, by the way, I'd also point out, has been pretty robust. It's not every relationship that can be created in one geopolitical context, which was one of shared opposition to the Soviet Union, which is when it was created, and it survived the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union. And the U.S.-Chinese relationship has continued to prosper for the most part in a very different geopolitical context. And that, to me, shows a degree of robustness. But I do think the biggest questions going forward are the nature of China itself. Where is Xi Jinping going to take China? Whether stability continues, or whether, as some would predict, China faces some large potential internal dislocations. If that were to happen, what is the relationship then between Chinese behavior beyond China's borders and what happens at home? You know, I'm not smart enough to answer those questions. But I would think that there's possibility. Let me put it this way. The idea that for the next 30 or 40 years, China's going to have as relatively smooth a sailing as it's had the last 30 or 40 years domestically, I would think unlikely. I would think China's going to face more problems coming from some of the contradictions and some of the problems I mentioned before about demographics, the environment, slower economic growth. So you don't have high levels of economic growth to lubricate away the tensions in Chinese society. So again, I can't predict what's going to happen. But I think the thrust of American foreign policy should not be on remaking China internally. Leave that to the Chinese. I think the thrust of our policy should be to encourage what we would see as fairly responsible Chinese behavior beyond its borders. In order to do that, again, I think we need an emphasis on both integration but also hedging. And so it's not incoherent. It's actually what's called for. Can't hear you, I'm sorry.
To be more integration, maybe economic integration as well, and more interdependence. But do you think China maybe has different ideas versus
look, what China's doing with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has gotten a lot of attention. The actual scale of it's quite modest. I don't see it as a threat to Western civilization as we know it. I'm far more relaxed about it. It's not an alternative to the World Bank or anything else. It's, I don't think, I wouldn't spend all of our time trying to discourage others from joining it. If others want to join it, fine. If we want to set up better mechanisms for development that compete with it, let's do it. We actually have some. Trade, investment, direct foreign investment, and so forth. So, again, I can't read what the long-term goals are of Chinese foreign policy, but obviously China is looking to enhance its position in that part of the world. I understand that. But I don't see that as a direct threat to our vital national interests. So again, my goal is to integrate China more firmly in regional and global arrangements. I would prefer to negotiate with them, or consult with them rather, about what those arrangements might be. They've taken that in that direction. And one of the reasons I think it's getting as much notice as it has is the US is not doing certain things. We've not approved IMF quota reform. It's uncertain whether we're going to approve Trade Promotion Authority leading to a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So we've been missing in action to some extent from the Asian economic space. We've not been nearly as active and as we should be. And so to me, the lesson to take from this is not so much that we should oppose China, but we should get our own foreign policy in gear.
John.
You've identified a very, very large deficit in needed order around the world. And to me, you haven't convincingly identified a commensurate capacity to create the order, to construct the order. I don't know if I misheard that, but I didn't hear anything that sounded like anything like up to the task. You also said something yesterday which struck me strongly, and I don't find particularly convincing. And I want to press you a little on that in relation to the gap between the need for order and capacity to construct. You said the United States is fine, and to me, maybe the United States is fine domestically. It's not my business to have opinions about that. But if you look at American power exerted across the world over the last 24 years and ask how effective it's been in securing the interests of the population of the United States. If you look from North Korea round to Pakistan, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Syria, to Libya, and if you look towards Russia and Ukraine, Georgia maybe, it just doesn't look to me as though that has been a very consecutive, well thought through and coherent approach to the optimal use of American power in the world. And I find it very difficult looking at American domestic politics from the outside not to think there's some connectability between what certainly doesn't appear very coherent and effective in its domestic politics and that.
Okay. So, two things. The capacity to, for those of you who couldn't hear, Professor Dunn, the first question was the gap between the scale of the problem as I laid it out, and to some extent how to go about fixing it, in particular the capacity to create order. That's what I was getting at. I don't think we call a big conference. We don't convene the Second Congress of Vienna. Well, part of the problem is I wouldn't know who to put in the room. You'd have different players for different challenges. In many cases also it'd be a waste of time because we're not there. That's where, again, I put the emphasis on consultations. I put the consequences on informalism. It might be for this or that problem, you bring in this set of countries or non-countries. When I was once asked to help deal with global health problems, and when I brought in people, had the head of the WHO, several ministers of health from select countries, but also had people from the Gates Foundation, some other foundations, several pharmaceutical companies, and some academics, and we sat around a table to work things out. When I was asked by President Bush 43, after 9/11, I was put in charge of arrangements for the future of Afghanistan. And when I sometimes held meetings, there were people from lots of NGOs and other places. You couldn't just do it with US government agencies. You had people who dealt with refugee issues and other such issues. So I think what you end up with is a heavy degree of selectivism. It's not consistency, and in many cases it's informal. You begin the process. The goal should be, over time, to make it more formal and more inclusive. But you can't begin with the formal inclusive. So you don't begin at the Security Council. You don't necessarily begin at any existing thing. You begin with talks among the most important countries. For example, on climate, you're not going to get a big agreement in Paris, but if 15 countries are 85% of the problem, why don't you focus on the 15 countries? When you look at the Iran negotiations, we're doing it with essentially a model of the P5 plus 1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. When you do the North Korean talks, which I don't think much of, again, we're done with a select grouping of countries. So what you do is you forge whatever kind of informal arrangement seems to make the most sense. Who's the most relevant, who has capacity, who might be like-minded, and so forth, and then you start there, and then you build up. I think that's the way. I think it's going to be bottom-up, and it's going to be different for every set of challenges. I don't think it's going to be the opposite of one-size-fits-all diplomacy. As a result, it's going to be incredibly demanding. It's going to be very uneven in the results, but I think that's the way we have to do it. And in some areas, we're not even ready for that. Something like cyber, we haven't even done the intellectual spade work. So I don't think you're even, in some cases, ready to convene the meetings. We've got to figure out what we're going to convene them around. So I just think there's a lot of, but I think that's the way it's going to happen. But it's I also think it's essential. I just don't think, if you leave it to when the problems surface, it's too late. Too late. So we've got to figure out a way of heading them off. So that's my approach on that. It's not elegant, but I can't think of a better way. Look, in terms of U.S. foreign policy over the last quarter century, since the end of the Cold War, I've written several books pretty critical of it. I was a big advocate of how the United States responded to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. I also participate in it, so I have a conflict of interest there when I say I think we did it basically okay. So, but a lot of things since, I was not, supportive of the Iraq War. I was not supportive of what we did in Libya. I was not supportive of what we didn't do in Syria. So there's not in other areas, though, other aspects of American foreign policy, selectively, I may be more supportive of. I don't think, though, the problems have largely come from domestic politics. Even though there's no consensus in the United States about foreign policy. There are fundamental disagreements about how much foreign policy you ought to have. There's fundamental questions about what the purposes of American foreign policy, how much to promote order as opposed to changes within countries, human rights, or humanitarian intervention, or what have you. There's fundamental questions of whether act multilaterally, unilaterally. These debates are all there. But for the most part, presidents have been pretty unencumbered. For the most part, given the constitutional inheritance of our system, given the patterns of American politics, for the most part, presidents have been pretty able to do what they want to do. So President Bush in 2003 did what he wanted to do vis-a-vis Iraq, and both the war later on with the surge, for which I think he deserves considerable credit. President Obama at one point tripled U.S. force levels in Afghanistan, then brought them way down. He took U.S. forces out of Iraq, then reintroduced several thousand more recently. He gave the speech in Cairo that he gave 6 years ago. He's done, did what he did vis-a-vis this or that decision about the peace process or Israel. And all these things were basically executive prerogative. Foreign policy in the United States is heavily weighted towards the executive branch. I tend to agree with that for the most part. I think it's very hard to run it otherwise. Now, every once in a while, Congress gets heavily in the act. It obviously has to on the Iran agreement because of sanctions. It has to on such questions as trade agreements, as it will. The whole spending question, the budget. And the fact that the ceilings, the so-called sequester, the limits it's placed on defense are obviously done by Congress. So Congress has significant impact. But by and large, I would think that the major decisions, whether you agree with them or not, for better and for worse, when the president decided not to respond to Syria after the use of chemical weapons, those were executive decisions. I don't think any of those can be attributed directly to the American political system. These were just, most of these were examples of executive decision-making.
Yes.
I just want to ask a question related to your 2 points. One is trade, and the other is multilateralism versus unilateralism. You said that given the situation of Doha around the WTO on multilateral front, the second best option would be bilateralism or regionalism. But what about unilateralism? I mean, most of the developing countries before that accounts for majority of the WTO members unilaterally liberalized their trade with the investment regime in the 80s and 90s. And it's because it's their own interest to do so. And only a rather minority of members of the WTO didn't do so, US, EU, and Japan, basically developed countries. So wouldn't there be a scope for the diplomacy or statecraft to be exercised domestically for unilateral liberalization in these countries? That's my question.
If the politics of trade are tough enough when they're not unilateral. So I mean, you know, it's a little bit like, I'm often struck how economists will stand up and say things like bilateral trade balances are irrelevant. What really matters is overall, and even that not necessarily. And I always want to say, well, you go testify on that, and, you know, and explain how trade deficits don't matter. So you may be right, in some cases, unilateral action would make sense. Or one of the arguments I make with a lot of the pending or possible trade deals is we have much more to gain than to lose, because our market is relatively open, not perfectly, but it's relatively open compared to others. So we would gain more in access, particularly for our agricultural goods and our services. But it's just very hard to sell, also because trade's one of those phenomena which those people who do pay a penalty for a trade agreement, who are far fewer than is often realized. Most people pay a penalty for technological innovation or trade, not for trade agreements. But if they do pay a penalty, in fact, for a trade agreement, those who pay a penalty feel the intensity of that far greater than those who benefit. And those who therefore feel the penalty, because whether it's real or not, will often have an outsized voice, which is why it's hard. So the answer is, there's some things you can do, but just the politics of it are tough. What you'll see with the politics of this current trade agreement is we'll end up looking for all sorts of things of education and training accounts to basically help those who have lost jobs, whether it's because of trade or trade agreements or not. It might just be technological innovation. But it takes a massive effort to build a narrow majority for trade. So in many cases, the unilateralism, even if it makes narrow economic sense, you just can't sell it politically.
Yes.
You're in charge.
Sorry, we're competing.
No, we're not competing at all. I apologize.
Yes.
I fully understand your skepticism about international organizations, and I fully understand and share your dismay with WHO and the role you mentioned Médecins Sans Frontières yesterday and the beneficial role they play. But I can see a problem with your multilateral approach because it will always have a legitimacy problem. And do we really have to give up on the international organizations? Is there not something that particularly the key funders of these organizations can do to really make them more fit for purpose than they are right now?
Look, you make a fair point. The formal, large participation, multilateral organizations have the greatest amount of legitimacy. And the legitimacy comes from the fact that you have all these actors who are present. The problem is that in many cases they can't perform. So yeah, ideally you would improve the quality of their performance. In many cases it just can't be done, whether it's because the participants won't allow it, the staff isn't up to it, or what have you. So my feeling is I don't give up on that. And my long-term goal is to embed things as best I can, but in the near and medium term I'm willing to work around things. And my feeling is you get as much multilateralism as you can. But you don't make it an all or nothing that you've got to do it through the formal existing organizations. We'll often end up with nothing. I mean, one would say during the Balkans, if we had said the only legitimate agency is the UN, and when the UN vetoed it, so then we would have sat on our hands, okay, well then a lot of people would have died. Or in the case of this case, if we said, look, it's the WHO or nothing, we're not going to let any NGO or anybody else, or the US military won't go there, it would have been much worse. So I'm not saying it's an ideal, but my feeling is it's a workaround. But it is a recognition of the limits of existing multilateral organizations. The goal should be to improve them, but in the meantime, you do the best you can with what either you've got or you can fashion. And hopefully if stuff works, then gradually your chance to embed it in the larger participation, more formal organization is there. I'd love to get there. That to me is a long-term goal. It's just not a near-term, it's not a very attractive option.
We have time for a couple more questions. So, yes. And then we'll
You're
move
very
on.
patient over here this minute.
Thank you. And it's a little bit of mischief, I'm afraid. Probably an unfair question, but given the overview of the conference and your knowledge of British politics, if pressed, where would you be putting an X in May?
Where would I put what?
Where would you be putting an X on a ballot box in May?
Oh, I won't.
You are allowed to duck that one.
Yeah, I will duck that. That's not my place. The only thing I would say, because it's somewhat related to that, is my own views that from an American point of view, it's obviously this country's decision to make to figure out its relationship with Europe. My own strong preference is that this country would remain in Europe. I think the process of leaving would be a massive distraction when we've got too many challenges to fight. And I for one, value Britain's role in Brussels. I think it's good for Britain. I think it's good for the EU. I think it's good for the United States. I don't see any problem that gets solved or improved by Britain leaving. So you can take that as
How you
what
vote
will.
on the referendum. There was someone at the back. Yeah, final question, thanks.
You identify the fluidity or the non-existence.
You have to shout, sorry.
Sorry.
You identify the non-existence of the Sykes-Picot borders in the Middle East. With that in mind, do you think an independent Kurdish state is conceivable? And if so, doesn't that just fuel the disorder in the region?
Yeah, I've come out in favor of an independent Kurdish state, particularly what I call a mini Kurdistan, certainly in Iraq and possibly with Syria. I think that makes sense given where we are in Iraq and Syria, and I would support that. I don't support a Kurdish state beyond that. I'm not saying that I don't support a Kurdish state that would draw from Turkey or Iran. But I do think, given what's going on in Iraq and Syria, given the threat that is posed to the Kurdish people, and given the state of both Iraq and Syria, I don't see the downside now. So I think the real debate is between enormous degrees of autonomy for a Kurdish entity or a Kurdish state. So it's more a question of packaging than reality. But the Kurds have also showed themselves to be the most capable fighters against ISIS. We've got, I think, there's a long history of cooperation between, I say, from the United States and the Kurds. So I would favor things going in that direction. And I realize that's not necessarily well received everywhere, but it is well received some places.
Okay, thank you everyone very much. Two things remain for me to say. The first is to remind you that if you'd like to come tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. that way in the Alison Richard building to the symposium for a wider discussion of the issues raised in these lectures, do please come along and register with CRASSH. You'll be very welcome. There will be space for you. The second thing is, following such a wide-ranging and thought-provoking set of reflections, which is absolutely in the spirit of these Humanitas lectures, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking Richard Haass for 3 fascinating lectures.